Until I bumped into her at a college reunion, I had not talked to Jackie in over 40 years. We did the obligatory quick checking in with each other, remembering old friends and events, and then decided that this relationship was worth a few more minutes together, more than could be expended in that arena. And so we agreed that when the reunion time was officially over, we would convene our own session at a quiet bar around the corner and do some more catching up. That's where her story really got interesting. It was simultaneously both spellbinding and almost impossible to make sense of. I'm getting ahead of the story, though. I met Jackie when I was a sophomore or junior in college. I was in Washington, D.C. I was part of that generation in the late 60s that was going to fix the world, that was going to solve all of the problems across America and overseas. And there was no better place to start than by going to school there. And we were a mix of students who were studying law and public administration and American politics and international diplomacy. And we would spend a good number of nights late into the evening debating back and forth about how best to go about that. How Jackie glommed onto our Lonely Hearts Club, I'm not quite sure. She may have felt a bit sorry for these guys who had no life outside of what we were doing. But Jackie was different. She had not come there to change the world the way we had. She was a communications and broadcasting major and was planning on a career in news telling. So while we would go back and forth with each other, Jackie would sit quietly aside from all that. I know Jackie had her own opinions, but whether she was Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, I can't tell you to this day. Some of that, I'm sure, was her own instinct, her own upraising, but an awful lot of it had to do with the journalistic training she was receiving, which taught her how to keep herself out of the story and instead let the story present itself with those who were the real deal makers. I lost touch with Jackie after graduation. Every now and then I would talk to an old friend, a mutual acquaintance, who would tell me a little bit about the progress of her career, how she had started out in a very, very, very small radio station where the news team consisted of Jackie and Jackie. And then there was the next stop, where it was Jackie and one more. Then came the day I was driving to work, listening as I always did to NPR, and all of a sudden, out of the clear blue, came a familiar voice and byline. Jackie was one of the reporters for NPR. And it was wonderful over the coming years to hear these stories pop up from her every now and then. You never knew when, from here or there, reporting on big events, both at home and abroad. Then came another day. I was watching the evening news and I yelled to my wife, "Come quick, come quick!" And she took me seriously that time. There was Jackie doing a stand-up reporting bit on the national nightly news when that was still something. And it was a delight for the next several years to watch Jackie's career progress. She clearly was well respected both by the audience who tuned in to hear what she had to say and by her peers and her bosses. And then she was gone. I never saw Jackie again. I never understood what had happened. I presumed that maybe that's the way of media these days, that they're always looking for the new, young, cheaper face. And so it's out with the old and in with the new. And besides which, well, I played that same game too, because there was a young man I had watched grow up in Buffalo. And when his time came, he came here to Newhouse. And wouldn't you know it, before long, he was broadcasting the weekend news on one of the major networks. So I forgot about Jackie until that night at the reunion. So later in the evening, as we had agreed, Jackie and I met up in a quiet bar. I told her I had a question for her. If she didn't mind, could she tell me what had transpired when she disappeared from sight from the media? She said, sure, it's the easy part of my story to tell. It got me to thinking, wondering. But she plunged into the story. She had been ready for change in her career, she said, and got approached about that time by one of the most respected congresspersons on Capitol Hill, who invited her to come on board as his chief spokesperson and senior advisor. And for the next few years, she played that role to a hilt. She took everything she knew from her previous work experience and put it to good use there inside the legislature, inside Congress, working across the aisle, as her congressperson liked to do, finding just the right words to bridge one side and the other side so they could come together and stitch a bill that could find bipartisan support. If I told you about some of those pieces of legislation, you would recognize them right now. And then Jackie paused, almost as if she was trying to decide whether to keep going or not. I had already done the math in my head, and I knew there were some years that were missing. The time that she had been up on Capitol Hill to where we sat there that night at the reunion, there was a gap. She took a gulp of wine, and then a second one, admitted that there was more to the story than she'd let on so far, and that she didn't like to talk about it. Not because it was so painful or embarrassing, but because she didn't quite know what to make of the story herself. Then, in a gesture I remembered from 4 decades earlier, she kind of shook her head and laughed at the same time and said, "Oh, what the heck? I'm never going to see you again. You've spent your life as a pastor listening to strange stories and talking about things that can't be seen or proved. And you're a whole lot cheaper than my therapist." And with that, she plunged into the story. There came that moment in our national history when those congresspersons who had learned to cross the aisle from one side to the other, to work with folks who came from differing parties and differing political philosophies, but to work together for the common good of all, when suddenly all those persons were thrown out, and in their place came a bunch of ideologues, left and right, People for whom speaking to those on the opposite side of an issue was harder to do than talking to the devil himself. And it was at that moment that her congressperson got unelected. And Jackie found herself not just out of a job, but disheartened and disillusioned. That everything she had built her life around and worked toward seemed so empty now, meaningless, gone, with hardly an explanation. There was an emptiness inside of her, she said. She admitted that she had tasted lots of things in life. She had been on the forefront of big events. And somehow those just didn't feel like they used to. She had known the bright lights of the media life, had been good at it, and it had no more appeal for her. She had tasted the power of sitting in the hall of Congress. And she looked at that as almost being as meaningless as anything else. She withdrew into herself. She cut off all contacts with friends, both from the ancient media days and the more recent legislative days. She paused again, took another big gulp from the glass of wine. I could see her collecting herself and deciding whether to keep going or not. And she did. I'm not sure it was a good idea, because I still don't know what to make of her story. But here it is. She talked about going out one day just for a walk, seeing if some of the old spark could get revived by looking at the familiar places that she had known herself for 4 decades. The Supreme Court building, the Capitol building, the National Archives, the White House, the Smithsonian. She walked past all those almost blindly in a fog and kept going. She recognized that she was moving, as she had done so many times in the past, toward the memorials, those great memorials that lift up the ideals of America. Her favorites: Lincoln, Jefferson, Martin Luther King. At each one, she stopped and paused and took time to read the words of these great leaders inscribed in stone. She remembered every other time that she'd come to visit. And the words had never failed to excite and inspire her, but today, nothing. Absolutely nothing. She said she left and began to walk back home. She realized that she was being directed somehow in a slightly different path from the one she normally took to get back to her apartment. And the more she proceeded in that direction, each passing block became a stronger and stronger sense of being tugged towards something that she didn't understand or know. Until at last she found herself standing before the National Holocaust Museum. She remembered having been there once before when it opened and she was doing part of the coverage of it. She hadn't been back since. But there was this overwhelming sense inside of her that she was meant to be inside there. She checked her watch and realized that it was almost closing time. Surely this could wait for another day, she convinced herself. Except she couldn't ignore this powerful feeling inside that she was meant to go inside. She went inside, paid her money, even though the woman at the desk said the exhibit's closed in less than an hour. You really should wait for another day. She could not wait. She took the elevator up to the 4th floor. She knew she didn't have much time. She did not know what she was looking for, but she had a sense that she would know it when she met it. And she walked deliberately through the exhibits on the 4th floor. Nothing grabbed her. So down to the 3rd floor she went, moving a little bit more speedily this time because, again, the clock was ticking. Nothing grabbed her. Dropped down one more floor to the 2nd floor. And there she ran into the room that was just filled with discarded shoes. The shoes of long gone people whose lives had been stolen from them. And the boots and the shoes and the high heels and the baby shoes all seemed to be as empty and forlorn as her own spirit felt. She was transfixed. Time stood still. And then she thought she heard something. It sounded like a whisper, just a soft whisper. She wondered if maybe she had gasped aloud at what she was observing, and she looked around to see if there was somebody else in the room, perhaps another tourist or a security guard advising her to be quiet. There was no one there. She wondered if maybe it was the mechanics of the building pushing air, hot or cool. It was nothing. Just that little sound that came again. Shh. 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 The kind of sound a mother makes with a baby hugged to her breast, trying to calm and quiet that young child. Shh. Shh. Jackie leaned across the table, wondering if I was following her story and willing to go with her on it. She admitted to me that she still could not explain it. All she knew, she said, was that afternoon she had left that building with a sense of peace and resolve that had never left her from that day. Thank you.